Hello there and welcome to JJ Paintings. I am JJ and today we're going to be doing, as you can see, a lore video. I'm sorry if I look quite tired, it's because I am quite tired. I've had a busy week, it's a Friday at time of recording, I had a lot of work to do, so I am about as tired as I look. But here we are anyway. I'm still committed to making sure you guys get some nice content. Yeah. So as you can tell from today's video, we're going to be doing another lore video because the Challenge 99 lore video all about the Howling Griffins was quite popular and everyone seemed to like it. So I thought I'd do another lore video. But I didn't want to do a lore video which is just based on the big battles and the famous individuals. I wanted to do one which takes a slightly different perspective, where it's more about cause and effect and a macro perspective, how everything is both interrelated and how it affects each other. It's more about looking at the relationships between certain events and certain groups, as opposed to just going, the Primarchs are this, or the Space Marines are that, or the High Lords of Terror are X. It's about a holistic approach, which is something we don't really do much when it comes to talking about the lore, but I think it's quite an interesting way of looking at it. But in any case, we're going to be taking this approach to talk about the Space Wolves today, and to do this, we're going to be painting this model right here. Yes, another Wolf Lord. If you remember my Primaris video from a few weeks ago, you'll probably recognise this is the other one. So, without further ado, let's crack on. Okay, so let's get the really obvious bits just out the way, just so that we can recap. Obviously, the Space Wolves, or Volk Fenrika, were the 6th Legion of the First Founding, and were famous for being the Emperor's executioners, a role they fulfilled very well during the Great Crusade, and it's implied that it had something to do with both the loss of the 2 missing legions, and they were known for disciplining Angron's World Eaters during the Great Crusade, as well as the more famous and more notorious seizing and raising of Prospero at the outbreak of the Horus Heresy. And there's also, spoiler alert, Leman Russ took a personal mission to stop Horus before he reached Terra. Obviously he failed, and Russ eventually disappeared, leaving no trace of his whereabouts, and potentially took the 13th Grey Company with him when we went. Okay, cool, so that's the Great Man origin story over. Let's talk about the actual Space Wolves. Now, one of the really interesting things about Space Wolves as a culture is that, in many respects, as a legion and as a chapter later on, they became more useful than their Primarch ever was, both in terms of their ability to fulfill their role within the Imperium. Instead of just being defined by the role set for them as the Emperor by the Emperor, they, like many other chapters, evolved and changed after the Horus Heresy into becoming defenders rather than just crusaders of the Imperium. And in many ways that's reflected in how they were able to become much more far-reaching than a lot of other chapters, which is quite impressive considering that they themselves are not fleet-based. Now, this is the difference between them and their organisation. Obviously, the Space Wolves only had one chapter from the second founding, which was the Wolf Brothers, that was ultimately destroyed. But the Space Wolf Grey Companies were considered to be about the size of individual Space Marine chapters in many ways. Now, obviously, they fluctuated throughout the years. In many occasions throughout history, the Great Companies themselves have been utterly destroyed, 1 or 2 at a time, or in some cases up to 11 of the 12 companies have been completely wiped out. But this still leaves a solid core of Space Marines on Fenris, or at least around the Fenrisian system, that are able to help rebuild the chapter. And talking of Fenris for a second, it's another very impressive thing that of all of the chapters out there, the Space Wolves still largely recruit from just one planet, Fenris. We see this similarly with other chapters such as the Salamanders, who only exclusively recruit from Nocturne and very rarely take aspirants from beyond their home planet, but with the Space Wolves they've made it exclusively that they only recruit from the Fenris system and Fenris itself. And whilst we're on Fenris, this is a really interesting point to talk about, because in the 10,000 years of Fenris being a Space Marine recruiting planet, it hasn't changed a huge amount. Now, the obvious things are there. It's a death world. Humans that live on Fenris are living pretty much in a pre-industrialized tribes, in very small states and in very small communities. They don't have anything beyond what the Iron Age tribes of, Earth did, and they are living in states of constant conflict and fostering a warrior culture. Now, if you've watched my video about the Howling Griffins, you're probably going to start seeing some parallels there straight away. And I know what you're thinking, that 10,000 years, that's a very long time to be living in a pre-industrialized state. Well, obviously humanity on planet Earth lived very much the same way for well over 15 to 25,000 years, without much change beyond the ability to plant seeds in lines next to each other and the ability to start creating metalwork. Now, the Fenrisian tribes do have that, but the difference is that they have one thing which our ancestors don't have: galaxy-spanning human empire that could very easily lift them out of that state and into a more digital and technological age. But obviously, this hasn't happened. Now, why is that? Now, the first and most obvious answer to that question is simple. the Space Wolves warrior culture is required people who are hardy and strong and able to live in very difficult conditions. Now, Fenris gives them that in bucket loads. It gives them the perfect kind of aspirants they need for their chapter. But on top of that as well, it's entirely possible that by keeping the states on Fenris constantly at a war footing, it's meant that Fenrisian culture and Fenrisian society hasn't actually shaped the Imperium the same way it has shaped the chapter. And this brings me on to my next point when it comes to talking about Fenris, is that Fenris was probably one of the only planets and its culture and its people that influenced the Primarchs more than the Primarchs influenced them. The other exception obviously being Vulcan with the Salamanders, and arguably Guilliman with the Guilliman when he was on Macragge. And also, the chapter itself surely would have some invested interest in being able to tame Fenris itself, but they haven't. And another plausible reason for that is, as I said, Fenris influenced Leman Russ, and Fenrisian culture influenced the chapter that was the Legion. And in many respects, this leads me on to the belief that not only was Fenris as a planet influential to Leman Russ, but by keeping the planet as it is, it's actually a monument in its own way to their lost Primarch. Leman Russ was brought up and raised within the wilds of Fenris. He grew to maturity living among animals and living among pre-industrialized tribes. That was his lifestyle, and that was the world he grew up in. To take that away from Fenris would almost be like ignoring the entire culture and history of the Space Wolves themselves. So this is probably one of the biggest influences to why Fenris has remained the same. It's not just a question of having warriors like that, it's also the fact that the Primarch that was raised there was so tied into that planet and to its culture, it has made it very much indistinguishable as to where the Primarch ends and Fenris itself begins. And to have that level of connection with your planet's culture and heritage and your Primarch is probably a very strong incentive to keep it very much the same. But in many ways, this also means that Fenrisian culture hasn't been influenced that much by the wider Imperium. You can see the influence of other legions on the Imperium, especially when we look at people like Robert Guilliman, his way of reorganizing the Imperium after the end of the Horus Heresy, but also in other, unfortunately, more nefarious ways. Alfarius and the Night Haunters' influence on the underbelly of the Imperium at large, taking on the shadowy underside of the Imperium that doesn't get seen often by the higher powers. We also see the massive influence that Lorgar inadvertently had on creating the massive ecclesiastical culture of worshipping the Emperor. That simply wasn't there before. But this is something which has come from other Primarchs influencing the Imperium. But obviously, the Space Wolves haven't had that effect. But in some respects, what that's done for them is given them a much greater sense of autonomy and freedom. Now, obviously, during the Great Crusade, Leman Russ was known for effectively going where he wished and fighting where he wanted, and that spirit has very much been brought over to the chapter as it is now. That hasn't gone away. But what is interesting in that is that this purity of remaining effectively separate from the Imperium and the Imperium's political leanings is that the Space Wolves have been able to remain far more focused on the actual threats that they see to the Imperium at large. Naturally, being one of the first founding chapters, their history and their understanding of history is actually incredibly strong and very profound. Now, the difference is that I'm not just talking about their feud, if you can call it that, with the Thousand Sons and Magnus the Red. What I'm talking about is understanding the causality of the fall of Horus, the resulting civil war, and how the Imperium has changed over 10,000 years. Not necessarily declined as much as some would argue it has, but in many ways they are more in tune with where it has come from and where it is now in a slightly more objective way, for want of a better word. They have taken a far more objective look at what the Imperium is and how it stands, whilst maintaining their own culture on their own planet, which is a bit more insular. Now, this makes them surprisingly good and surprisingly impartial arbiters of justice within the Imperium when it comes to defending the worlds of humanity. And I use that word quite specifically. Like other chapters, they have become defenders of the Imperium rather than the Crusaders they were, and in many ways their roles as executioners within the Imperium has been taken over by groups such as the Inquisition and the ecclesiastical parties like the Adeptus Sororitas and the Ordo Hereticus within the Inquisition, as I mentioned earlier. So they aren't the persecutors of the people within the Imperium the way they may have been intended to be, but in some respects this has actually benefited them, because it means that they are able to go and fight where they will. And thinking about the personality of the Space Wolves, that wouldn't have suited them very well, because they only ever really answered directly to Leman Russ and to an extent to the Emperor. They were never really going to take the instruction or the direction from the High Lords of Terror, for example, with particular grace, and it's unlikely that they ever would have maintained that role as the executioners of the High Lords of Terror in place of the Emperor. particularly well, and it's unlikely that that would have sat particularly well with them either. So in some respects, the Imperium and the Space Wolves have benefited. The Space Wolves have become a very independent and autonomous group, fighting the real threats to the Imperium as they see them, and largely leave the politicking of the Imperium to others, rather than having to be pulled into a role that wouldn't have necessarily fitted them in the Imperium as it is today. But the other thing to remember is that the big advantage with this approach, obviously, is it means that they're able to respond to threats that they recognise from being from the past and understand the severity of them. I mean, obviously, they didn't turn up during the First War of Armageddon for no reason, and many threats of the Imperium from the Heresy and in the later years have all very much been the first thing that they have responded to. They've taken on a lot of the responsibilities and held on to a lot of the history of the early Imperium that you don't really see reflected in a lot of the other chapters or in a lot of the rest of the Imperium. However, one of the greatest things that you can say about Fenrisian culture is that they really have maintained their absolute loyalty to the Imperium over the years. In a weird way, they've actually maintained it in a slightly more puerile way than a lot of the other ones, and a lot of the other chapters have, and a lot of the other groups within the Imperium have. Now, unlike Guilliman and his Imperium Secundus, which is a contentious issue unto itself, it was very clear that Leman Russ was always willing to ride or die for the Emperor, and that was very much the end of it. But with the Emperor gone, and obviously Leman Russ gone, it could have been very easy for the Space Wolves to become a very insular group, very similar to what the Adeptus Custodes did, when they started to retreat further and further into the palace, becoming more and more isolated from the Imperium at large. And it's very impressive that the Space Wolves didn't do that. As I said, they became very much the arbiters for fighting the older enemies of the Imperium, and being some of the swiftest defenders of the Imperium as well. And the other thing to remember in that respect as well, because they are able to go where they want and do as they will and fight who they believe is the biggest threats, it's made them far more reactive and far more responsive than a lot of other groups in the Imperium are. And again, seeing as they are not a fleet-based chapter and how far and how big their chapter is overall, this is quite impressive. And it also leads to the very interesting point that the High Lords of Terror, the Inquisition, whoever really arbitrates and moderates the Space Marines as a whole, have left them very much alone. There may have been rumblings in the lore, they may have had their run-ins over the past and contentions with the purity of their gene seed, but it's never led to them being destroyed or censored. They've always been able to carry on the way they have. And why is that? Well, first of all, if we take what we've learned so far today of thinking they are swift responders to crises within the Imperium, their loyalty is very easily proven. They have a very large number of warriors that are committed to the defense of the Imperium against threats that are a lot bigger than a lot of other forces could reasonably respond to in time. And of course, they are one of the first legions. That makes it very hard both politically and logistically for anyone to want to remove them from that post, and ultimately it does mean that as a chapter and as a staple within the Imperium, they are a very necessary defensive bulwark against the enemies of the Imperium. But the other thing which the Space Wolves bring in this regard as well is they have a connection to the past that a lot of other Space Marines simply don't have, because unlike all of the other first founding chapters, they have changed so little in terms of both their organisation and where their influences come from. They have a far stronger connection to the Great Crusade and unfortunately the Horus Heresy than just about any of the other chapters do. It's arguable if Robert Guilliman had never been resurrected, they still would have maintained the strongest connection out of all of the first founding chapters, and it is only from Guilliman's response that the Ultramarines, by dint of Guilliman being there, have now a greater claim to the past than the Space Wolves do. But what it means for the future of the Imperium is obviously the Space Wolves can be relied upon to persecute the enemies of the Imperium and defend its citizens. Now, the other thing to take into consideration is with the return of Guilliman, there's the Ultima founding, and there are now Space Wolf second founding chapters, and most of them are quite far-flung from the home order Fenris, and it was a point of great contention within the Primaris Space Wolves that they wouldn't be joining the chapter, because you've got to remember is that for 10,000 years the descendants of the other chapters and the other legions were all slowly rolled out and they've all had successors, but the Space Wolves simply haven't done that. Now that is obviously to do with the Curse of the Wolfen being something which they can only manage themselves, and the second it goes somewhere else it's a lot harder for them to maintain and manage their gene seed when it's not on Fenris. But so far it seems to have worked, but whether or not that will remain the case is debatable. It's entirely possible that Guilliman hedged his bets slightly when he did send a lot of the Space Wolf second foundings to very remote or to very dangerous frontiers, knowing that ultimately they're less dangerous to the Imperial core worlds or to the heart world or the home worlds of the Empire if they should turn or if anything should happen, which is a smart move in the grand scheme of things, but it could be read as being a little bit hedging your bets and maybe not having the absolute most faith in the descendants of Leman Russ and the 6th Legion. However, when all is said and done, the Space Wolves still stand. They stand for Terra, they stand for the Emperor, they stand for humanity as a whole. And considering the challenges that they've faced and the rivalries within the Imperium and from outside that they've had to deal with, that's a fantastically difficult challenge for them to overcome, but they have done it. And the other reason why it's important to remember the Space Wolves are an essential part of the Imperium's history and its defence. And the thing is that now that we know that the Space Wolves are an essential part not just of the Imperium's defence, but also of its history, it's easy to see why they themselves take so much pride and are very laissez-faire about their position within it. Because in many respects it's possible that the Space Wolves know that they are a much more important bulwark than maybe anyone else wants to give them credit for. But even if that's not the case, and even if they are constantly aware that they are in danger of being outed or being sentenced to censure or destruction, they themselves know in their hearts that they do not present a threat to the Imperium. They are loyal. And at the point that no lesser authority than the Grey Knights can vouch for the Wolfen, that really should say it all in the eyes of most people. But the last thing I want to say on this topic is that the Space Wolves themselves inadvertently are a bigger target for some of the larger threats to the Imperium. I haven't really said much about the seizing and raising of Prospero much. For one reason, is it's a well-documented story, and that particular enmity between the Space Wolves and the Thousand Sons is well documented and you can find it elsewhere. But it does have another very unintentional side effect. Fenris, the Space Wolves, and even Russ are in many ways a bigger target for Magnus the Red than perhaps even Terra is. Now, in some respects, this makes it very dangerous to be a Space Wolf, but on the other hand, it means that Terra may only ever be a secondary priority. Ultimately, when we look at the relationship between the two of them and we look at the history, every time Magnus the Red has had the opportunity to attack Terra, he hasn't. He's always gone after the wolves. And we've seen that constantly in the sieges of Fenris, the constant manipulation, when the Dark Angels turned up and Fenris was besieged by demons. All those forces that weren't helping Abbadon get out the Eye of Terror weren't going to Terra itself. They were focused on Fenris. So as long as Fenris stands, in some respects it acts as a very good bulwark and a very good distraction for some of the other forces. In some respects, you could argue then that the Fenrisian presence is a good way to keep the opponents of the Imperium divided. As long as Fenris stands, it's unlikely that someone like Magnus the Red or some of the other descendants of the Thousand Sons or even other legions or some of the other traitor legions and possibly other threats are less likely to want to go for the centre of the Imperium and will be more interested in focusing on the Space Wolves. Again, when we think about how formidable the Space Wolves are both as a presence militarily but also how autonomous they are, it's very easy to see why they've created so many enemies and why they're considered such a massive threat. And in many ways, that's an advantage for them. So, when we put all that together, it's very easy to see why the Imperium still needs the Space Wolves, why they have such an important place, not just in the lore or in the canon, but also from a very practical perspective, why they need to be maintained. And knowing that they've had the resource boost that's been given to a lot of other chapters with the Indomitus founding and the Primaris makes them even more dangerous and perhaps makes them probably one of the best chances the Imperium has at its longevity. But I leave this to you, as always. Tell me, what do you think? Do you think the Space Wolves are that important to the Imperium? Do you disagree with me on this point? Do you think there's other chapters that are more important or more influential? Do you think Fenrisian culture has had an influence on the Imperium in some way more than I've expressed here today? Let me know your thoughts. I look forward to hearing from you. So I hope you found that video interesting, this little chat about the lore and the background of the Space Wolves in a slightly more holistic and macro perspective way. I think this is one of those things which would be quite interesting to take a bit further, and maybe I'll do more on this if you guys like it, so let me know your thoughts below in the comments as always. And whilst you're down there, like, subscribe, all that good fun YouTube shilly stuff, and thank you very much for watching, goodbye, and have a lovely day.